You've also written about this connection between mindfulness and kind of, you mentioned just believing these stories of the inner critic, and kind of with meditation, I guess you can go from just believing it to be true to seeing them as stories, seeing them as narratives. And that seems to be a very powerful way to kind of, I guess, to interrogate the barriers that we put up, the coping mechanisms that block us from being kind of open to love, both for ourselves and just generally.
I think it is, it's maybe one of the more subtle things we ever do in meditation practice, but it's so critical and it's so freeing to just see the assumptions that are guiding us as assumptions. And that doesn't mean they're all incorrect. Some of them might be quite true, but they're not all true. And to just have some space to at least question. And sometimes I tell the story about how when I first began teaching meditation, which was 1974, when I came back from India, the format which we borrowed from Goenka of how we teach intensive retreats, which is how we started, is, you practice, or there are Q&A sessions, or something happens during the day, and there's one formal lecture at night, there's one discourse at night. For 45 minutes or an hour. And I was teaching with Joseph Goldstein, my colleague. We were invited to teach a 1-month retreat. That was the first retreat we taught in the States. And I was terrified of public speaking, terrified. And I couldn't give a single one of those talks. So Joseph had to speak for 30 nights. And people were coming up and yelling at him, like, why won't you let her speak? Why won't you let her have a voice? And he said, I would love a night off. Talk to her. But I couldn't do it. I was absolutely petrified. And the story I was telling myself was that I was going to be in the middle of a talk and my mind would go blank and I would just sit there and that people would judge me. And it was only later, and this was long before I went to Burma and formally did loving kindness practice, that I thought, there is that one kind of practice, like maybe if I only talked about loving kindness and my mind went blank, I could just launch into the guided meditation. Maybe nobody would know. And that's how I could begin to give talks. And it was after that I realized, they're all kind of loving kindness talks in that we're gathered here together for a sense of connection. Nobody's sitting here thinking I'm like the ultimate expert in this field and that, they want to imbibe my expertise. It's like, they're all about loving kindness, and that's when I could give talks. And, the story I had been telling myself earlier about needing to be perfect and never making a mistake, never even pausing, because it would be so embarrassing or whatever it was. It was just a story. And to be able to see it in the moment as that is the way to not be bound to it.
I think there's also the aspect of resolving the inner critic through responding to it kind of lovingly, I guess. This is also something you've written about, right? That if you're critical of the inner critic, then you're just going to kind of get caught up in a loop. But it can be a challenge, I guess. But if you just kind of see where that's coming from and allow it to be, that can be the way to move through it.
Yeah. I mean, that is really a critical understanding, I think, about mindfulness in general. And I think the inner critic is a wonderful place it's a wonderful example of just that. So one of the things we suggest is that if you have a persistent, very critical voice within, and it's not the kind that's giving you useful information, it's just bringing you down, give it a name, give it a wardrobe, give it a persona. Because, as you said, it's all about how you're going to relate to it. So what's our temptation? One extreme, which we've talked about, is just buying into it. Like, you're right. You're always right. I'm worth nothing. The other extreme, though, is hating it or being ashamed of it or freaking out about it. Like, in my case, it would be, I've been meditating for 50 years. What are you still doing here, And trying to repress it or push it away. And that doesn't work either. And so we talk about mindfulness as a place in the middle where we're fully aware and connected to what's happening, but there's some spaciousness. So I sometimes go on to say, I've named my own inner critic Lucy, based on, with apologies to any Lucys who are listening, based on the character in the Peanuts comic strip. Because I moved into this house once, a friend was renting it for several of us to do a retreat in, and someone had left a cartoon from that, had left a strip from that cartoon on the desk in the bedroom I was moving into. And in the first frame, Lucy is talking to Charlie Brown, and she says, Charlie Brown, what your problem is, the problem with you is that you're you. And then in the second frame, poor Charlie Brown says, well, what in the world can I do about that? And then Lucy says, I don't pretend to be able to give advice. I merely point out the problem. And somehow whenever I was walking by the desk, my eye would fall just on that line. Problem with you is that you're you. Because that Lucy voice had been so dominant in my earlier life. And, but, then I had all this mindfulness training, and something happened very soon after I saw the cartoon. Like something great happened for me. And my first thought was, it's never going to happen again. And my response to that was, hi, Lucy. And chill out, Lucy, just chill. Which is different than, you're right, Lucy, you're always right. And it's also different than, I cannot believe Lucy's still here. And I will never get rid of this voice, and this is so awful. And so that's the whole point. The same pattern may arise, but you have such an entirely different relationship to it that everything changes.